We're from Fancy Tiger Crafts.
And we love knitting. I'm going to show you how to cut and then pick up stitches from a steeked edge. The word steek refers to these extra stitches which have been worked across a space in your knitting, which will be cut open later, usually for a cardigan or an armhole or even a neck opening. Steeks are useful as they allow you to work in the round when otherwise you would have to work back and forth, which would mean you'd have to work on the purl side while doing color work, which you want to avoid at all costs. It would make your yarn be on the front as you're floating it, and it would just be really hard to work that way. So with color work, you always want to work in the round when possible, and steeks allow you to do that because once you cut them open, you will have a flat piece or an opening in your piece that you've worked in the round. So this is kind of like a steek for an armhole. It doesn't go all the way down the knitting. This is a side seam, and this is the steek stitches. There's 5 stitches in this steek, and so these lines of color work right here are actually part of the steek. They're not part of the color work. So if I turn my swatch like this, that will be this would mimic the armhole of a sweater. This swatch has been knit in the round to avoid having to work back and forth in color work. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it open, and then we'll get a better look at our steek. Before getting out your scissors, it's best to block the project to set the stitches into place. You may want to reinforce your steeked edges with crochet or sewing, but with rustic yarns like Shetland wool or this Portuguese wool, it isn't necessary. Knitting doesn't unravel horizontally, so once I pick up the stitches, it'll stabilize the steeked edge. If you use a slippery yarn, you may want to reinforce the edges with crochet or a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine. As I'm cutting this open, it's very similar to cutting a steek, and this could be the front of a sweater, which will be cut open to be a cardigan. I'm going to cut down these purl stitches all the way up the center of this. And then I'll be able to lay my swatch flat and you'll get a better look at it. This is mimicking my side seam on my sweater, and so I have 5 stitches on hold here, and then my steek goes the rest of the way to the top. This at the top will be seamed to become like the shoulder of my sweater. In this steek, it's 5 stitches across, so you can really see the steek best in this colorwork section here. This is the first stitch, the first column of stitches in the steek, and it alternates color just so each of the colors that are in the sweater are worked across the steek. When you cut your steek open, you want to cut down the center of the very center column of stitches of your steek. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Sometimes in sweaters, especially if there's a large section that doesn't have color work in it, this center stitch will be a purl stitch, and then you'll cut right down the center of the purl stitch. It helps you find that center a little bit easier. So I'm just cutting very carefully. I'm using very sharp scissors to cut right down the center of the steek. So now you can see that that will become an armhole. Before I pick up stitches, I want to go ahead and seam the armhole. So I'm going to do that and then come back and show you how to pick up stitches for the steek. Now that I've seamed up my shoulder seam, I'm ready to pick up these stitches from my steek and move on to what will become my sleeve. If you look at the steek, I cut right down the middle of the middle stitch, and then there's 2 more stitches of steek to either side of that. And then my true color work from my sweater begins. So there's 1, 2, and 3. The 3rd column is my actual color work part of my sweater. The seam for my sleeve, where I'm going to pick up, is right in between the last column of steek stitches and the first column of knit stitches. First, I'm going to pick up the 5 stitches that I set aside from my underarm. And I have my actual needle here that I'm knitting with, but I'm going to use a much smaller needle to pick up my stitches. The reason why I'm going to do that is because I want to pick up every single row of stitches as I work my way around the armhole. And then I'm going to decrease to make the correct number of stitches for my sleeve. So that first row is going to be a lot more stitches than I really need, and using a smaller needle will just make it sort of settle in and not pop out if I use the correct size needle. So I'm picking up these 5 stitches from the underarm. Taking out my yarn that had it on hold. And then I'm going to find that first row of my actual sweater and fold the steek to the inside of the armhole right along this line in between the last steek stitch and the first stitch of the sweater. So I'm folding it along there, all the way down to my underarm. And then I'm going to start picking up stitches using this smaller needle. Before I pick up the steek stitches, I'm going to pick up a couple stitches between the live stitches and the steek stitches, just so that there's not a hole in the underarm where that comes together. So I'll just pick up 2 stitches here, kind of at that point that's not quite the side of the sweater and not quite the underarm. And then I'm going to get to the real side of the steek. So I'm going to find the stitch that is part of the sweater and then stitch that's part of the steek. And there's going to be 2 bars that are facing the edge that I've folded out. I'm going to go into the stitch that's in the sweater and all the way through to the stitch that's in the steek. I'm going through the middle of both of those stitches. Then I'm going to wrap my yarn and pull it through both. Then I'll find the next stitch up in the column and do the same thing. Go through the front of the sweater stitch and right through the steek stitch behind it. And I'm just going to do this all the way around my armhole. And having them folded over like that and going through every stitch is going to help stabilize that steek and keep it from unraveling. Although the yarn doesn't ravel, or the knitting doesn't ravel horizontally, so unless you are really trying to unravel it, you're not going to have that problem. Picking up all the stitches all the way up. And you don't really need to worry about how many stitches you're picking up. It's going to be more stitches than you need for your sleeve, but on the next row we'll decrease to get the right number of stitches for the sleeve. As I get to the shoulder seam, it's a little bit harder to pick out where that fold is. I'm going to go to the other side and find the fold on that steeked edge, and then sort of go up to the shoulder seam and just pick up and make it like kind of ooch its way over to the correct placement on the other side of the steek. And then I'm going to go ahead and start doing more of a magic loop method here as I go around this turn. That makes it easier. Now I've gotten to that little space between my steek and my underarm, so I'm going to pick up a couple more stitches here to close up what might be a hole if I didn't do that. And you'll notice that your steek wants to fold to the inside of your sweater, especially after you've picked up those stitches. If we look at the inside, you can see it's just folding to the inside of the sweater. Now I'm going to place a marker for the beginning of my round, and I'm going to work my underarm stitches. And actually I meant to put a stitch marker at the end of my underarm, so I'll put that there now. And I'm going to switch to the needle size that I'm using for the rest of my sweater, that I'll be using for my sleeve. And now, since this isn't the actual sleeve size that's on the sweater, I don't have a stitch count for what my sleeve is going to be. But I do know that I'm going to need to decrease to about like 80% of the stitches. So as I go around here, I'm going to knit 3 and then knit 2 together, and that'll turn 5 stitches into 4 stitches for each 5 stitches. It will then be 4, and that'll give me about 80% of the stitches that I have on here now. But if you're following the pattern, there should be a stitch count that you're aiming for. If you have changed the size of your sleeve hole, if for example you want to adjust the sleeves for your body, then you could use that like 5 to 4 stitch count to give you an idea of where to aim for. So I'm going to leave my small needle behind and start working with my pattern size needle. I'm knitting 2 together. Oh, well, dropped my stitch marker, but I'll get that back on there the next time I come around. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and then knit 2 together. 2. That gives you an idea of how to get your sleeve started. And then I think you can take it from here. Good job picking up your steek. And there's the sleeve.